Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Leeser with Tulsa Global Alliance. Welcome to this evening's event in cooperation with the United States Institute of Peace, which will focus on Belarus, the aftermath of the 2020 elections there, and the situation with Russia and Ukraine and regional stability. Tulsa Global Alliance is recording today's talk and will share it on TGA's social media later. And if you have questions for our speaker today after his talk, please write them in the chat box. Our speaker, by the way, is Dr. Donald Jensen with the United States Institute of Peace. Just a few words about Tulsa Global Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization that builds global community by working with the city of Tulsa to manage exchanges and activities between Tulsa and its 8 international sister cities, which are San Luis Potosi, Mexico, Kaohsiung, Taiwan, Beihai, China, Tiberias, Israel, Utsunomiya, Japan, Zelenograd, Russia, Celle, Germany, and Amiens, France. And this year marks the 40th anniversary of the Sister City program in Tulsa. TGA also hosts participants in the United States State Department International Visitor Leadership Program and promotes international business and global education. We're very fortunate to partner with the United States Institute of Peace on this evening's program. And the United States Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for the US and global security. In conflict zones abroad, the Institute works with local partners to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. So our speaker this evening is Dr. Donald Jensen, who's Director of Russia and Strategic Stability at the United States Institute of Peace, and also an adjunct professor at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. He's also a frequent commentator on media about the region of the former Soviet Union. And he'll share his insights on Russia, Ukraine, and the current situation in Belarus, implications for regional stability and US security, and his thoughts on the best path forward. A former US diplomat, Dr. Jensen provided technical support for the START, INF, and SDI negotiations. From 1996 to 2008, he was Associate Director of Broadcasting and Head of the Research Division at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. He writes extensively on the domestic, foreign, and security policies of Russia, Ukraine, and the other post-Soviet states. He received his PhD and MA from Harvard and BA from Columbia, and he's fluent in Russian. But if you think that's all, he's also a noted baseball historian specializing in the dead ball era in the 19th century game, and a member of the Society for American Baseball Research. And he's written or co-authored many books and articles on the sport. He was 2015 winner of the Chairman's Award of the SABR 19th Century Committee, and is a regular lecturer at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Dr. Jensen, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for that kind introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? First of all, I want to thank you for hosting me. It's very important for USIP to build upon our relationship with the TGA, can I call it? We've had visitors from Oral Roberts University to our headquarters in Washington, D.C. We have great connections in Oklahoma. We engaged with more than 30 schools, and participated in the Peace Day Challenge, Lincoln Elementary School, Norman High School, and Tulsa Community College. On a personal note, it's important. Growing up in rural California, and I used to go attend events at an equivalent institution in San Francisco. It's very important to me to encourage and foster engagement in American foreign policy and international relations to people all over the country. And again, I'm very pleased and honored to be invited by all of you. It's very, very important. Second, I would say 2 words about Oklahoma and Mickey Mantle. And if I were there in person, I would take an extra day and drive about 70, 100 miles to the Northeast to not only Commerce, where he given credit for growing up, but also the town starting with an S I can't even pronounce, but is one of my heroes, and glad to be talking to all of you. Yes, a lot is going on. Yes, we spend a lot of time, most of the last 3 weeks, talking about Putin and Biden and Russia and Ukraine and also Belarus. So what I wanted to do a little bit is to lay out the lay of the land as I see it, talk about a little bit. Spavinov, Eric said, thank you. Is that pronounced okay? Spavinov? Okay, I would probably a museum there, Eric. I would go to both. I have to say I'm a little bit leaning to Willie Mays. I'm a Giants fan, but Mantle would certainly be my number two. But I wanted tonight to talk a little bit about what's going on in general terms, then open it up to questions. And if I don't address something of particular interest to you, please raise your hand and ask. Or you can always email me at USIP, and I'll be glad to take the time to answer address your concerns. Again, the situation is changing almost by the day. As I told Bob before we went on the air, someone asked me this afternoon whether Putin had invaded Ukraine yet. And the last time I checked, which was about 45 minutes ago, not yet. But I want you to, when you look at what we talked about tonight, I want to put it in a broader context, first of all. Second, to talk about Belarus, not so covered as Ukraine, but both. Third, talk about the Biden response so far to let's call it the Putin challenge or the Russia challenge, because it's a very, very complicated situation. The Biden administration, and I know them pretty well, they don't have even all their people in place yet. So Putin, with his unerring sense of timing, is providing some problems, causing some trouble before everybody even sat down to their desks. So first of all, if you have a chance, I would highly recommend the April 9th report by the Director of National Intelligence, which summarizes the threats to the United States in the world. That's April 9th. Turn to the Russian section. The section's called Russian Provocative Actions, and it lists the ways in which Russia is challenging the US in the world. There's sort of a parlor game in Washington arguing about what's the greater threat: China, Russia, Iran, terrorism. You can rank them any way you want, and various interagency reports have ranked them in different ways. But tonight we're going to talk about Russia, and I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the findings that the DNI published on April 9th about Russia. First, and I'm not going to read them all, we assess Moscow will employ a variety of tools, influence campaigns, intelligence, counterterrorism cooperation, military aid, and other things, including assassination, to advance its interests and undermine the interests of the United States in the world. Second, we expect Moscow's military, I'm shortening, to challenge the interests of the United States and its allies. Third, and this is for the foreseeable future. Third, we assess that Russia will remain the largest and most capable rival to the US for the foreseeable future in the area of the weapons of mass destruction. That is to say, missiles, nuclear weapons, and all those new, very troubling systems like cyber, like hypervelocity weapons, and so forth, that threaten not only the United States, but threaten to undermine the entire international system. Third, and I will not read all of them, but you get the idea, we assess Russia will remain a top cyber threat as it refines and perfects its capabilities. We've seen that just in the last week, where where President Biden has imposed sanctions on Russia for not only its interference in the 2020 national elections, but also, conducted a cyber attack in recent months, all of which are very troubling, all of which did cause damage. Okay, so that's the official position of the United States. But let me talk about, what does Putin want? Well, first of all, the Russian elite is remarkably united behind a few core values toward the United States. First of all, they find the international system unfair to Russia. They feel themselves as a victim. Second, they see the United States as profiting from Russia's victimhood and thus the United States, its allies, and international organizations. NATO, the European Union, especially the UK, Canada, and so forth, are threats to Russia. And thus, its foreign policy is dedicated to correcting what it sees as that imbalance. And that means, because they're very conscious that they have a weaker economy than the United States, they're very conscious of their technological inferiority to the United States, although they're narrowing the gap, especially on weapons. They're very conscious of that. So what do they do to make up for that gap? They play to their strengths, quickness of response. The West tends to be bulky and big and multinational. Russia can exploit the vulnerabilities it detects in the United States, in France, in Italy, in the UK, in a way that goes to Russia's advantage. Third, and finally, Russia wants to be a great power. Putin's view of Russia has Russia an equal to the United States and China. And I'll answer any questions you might have about China, if you'd like. Putin wants to be at the table with the US, with China, in any major global issue, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's climate change, or whether it's an anti-racism vote in the United Nations. So Russia tries to project power to maximize its strengths, not by going toe-to-toe with the United States, but by exploiting the US vulnerabilities. And unfortunately, the West, whatever country you pick, has had a lot of vulnerabilities. This includes information warfare. This includes use of money. This is, Eric said Syria, yes, Syria. This includes cultural ties. There are many countries, Serbia, parts of Georgian society, Bulgaria, which have long-standing cultural and religious ties to Russia. It uses those to project power. We sometimes call it soft power, but it's not always particularly soft. So Russia tries to use those levers of power: information warfare, cyber, culture, money, bribery, and I have to say, unfortunately, killing its enemies, whether poison or otherwise, to get what it wants. And what it wants is exactly what I just listed, those four elements. Fair international system, equal to the United States. It's often called in your economic courses a status quo power, but that's really only a half the equation. Russia is both a status quo power, it wants to be a great power, and also a transformative power. It sees the system as arrayed against it. This is traditionally, in the last 5 years, very, very different than what is taking place in China, which sees the world differently, even though China and Russia are coming closer and closer to being not allies so much as partners. The final point, and gets us to Belarus and Ukraine, is that for Russia, the foreign policy is a direct outgrowth of its domestic politics. It's a country with a very different political and economic culture than the United States. The regime does not have really the rule of law in any significant sense, really any strong political institutions. It's very much an autocracy. It's very sensitive to its geographical openness to foreign threats, both from the East and the West. And so it tends to act in ways that preserve Putin's authoritarian rule. So for all you read about Ukraine or Belarus and have read in the past few weeks, part of the problem with dealing with Russia, part of the problem is that Putin sees the kind of grassroots movements happening in Ukraine and Belarus as a threat to his own rule. They remember what happened in '91 when the coup ousted Gorbachev and ended the Soviet Union. They tell themselves this will not happen again. So the sad plight of Alexei Navalny is in many ways the same issue as dealing with Ukraine and dealing with Belarus. and dealing with the US and complaining about NATO expansion and so forth. So I want to pause right there. I guess Bob will take questions at the end, but let me now move on to Belarus and Ukraine, but taking Ukraine first. Excuse me, my earpiece is coming out. Ukraine, a very interesting place, very clearly not Russian, much to Kremlin's chagrin, has had three grassroots revolutions in the past 2 decades, each one trying to wrench the country out of a very corrupt, Russian-dominated orbit. The last one in 2014 resulted, as you all know, in the creation of a democratic government that wants to be in NATO, the democratic government that wants to be in the European Union, and a civil society that is very active, very pro-Western, and in many ways, the mentality is more like Central Europe, which after all, that's what Western Ukraine used to be a part of, than it is the big neighbor to the east. So Russia, after bribing essentially Ukraine's previous dictator to stay the course and be a close ally of Moscow, failed. The grassroots now famously ousted President Yanukovych. Ukraine made its cast its lot with the West. Russia could not stand that choice. Russia invaded the eastern part of the country in 2014. Russia illegally annexed Crimea. And in doing so, it employed heavy propaganda, which colors the perception of many people in the West today about what's going on there. Heavy use of propaganda, the economic and commercial ties it had to corrupt Ukrainian industrialists and disguised troops, heavy diplomacy. And so that war, which has gone on from the spring of 2014 to this evening, continues. And what we're seeing now is the buildup after several years of relative military quiet, again, a massive Russian buildup on the Ukrainian borders, south, east, a massive militarization of the Black Sea, a historically and currently very contentious I was going to say piece of real estate, historically contentious location. And the question that has been puzzling everybody in Washington the past 3 or 4 weeks, why the buildup? Will Putin invade? If Putin invades, what's our response going to be? Nobody wants to go to war over Ukraine. Nobody wants a nuclear catastrophe. But what has happened in the past 6 years is that Ukraine has, despite its incredible problems of corruption at home, built up very solid security ties to Central Europe, to Britain, to NATO, and especially to the United States. We are essentially a military partner of Ukraine. We give them assistance, we give them training. Russia, if you follow the saga of the Nord Stream pipeline in the Baltic, the everyday, Russia uses energy as a political weapon. It wants to build an energy pipeline around Ukraine, so it not only can sell gas to Western Europe, but it can undermine the Western unity behind Ukraine. In particular, the NATO members, if you look at them individually, are not uniformly behind the US view of what's going on in Ukraine. The Germans and the French in particular, and the Italians especially, are less than unified behind supporting Ukraine for various reasons. The Germans, for example, have a huge economic relationship with Russia and feel if they push Putin too hard, they're going to lose their economic profitability of the many companies. So for them, to be crude, it's more important to sell BMWs in Moscow than it is perhaps to give Ukraine the backing that Ukraine wants and needs if it is to resist Russian aggression. Now, a pause there on Ukraine and move to Belarus, which is a very interesting case, less publicized the last few months, but still a place of very strong geopolitical significance. Belarus's story is both similar in some ways and different in others. Unlike Ukraine, Belarus is traditionally closer to Russia in culture, in language. Most Belarusians speak Russian primarily, and Ukraine is a bilingual society. Belarus is traditionally much more close to Russia. Belarus has been run by a dictator, Lukashenko, for most of the 20 plus years. Lukashenko has tried both to keep his power, which means leverage the West so that Russia doesn't take him over, but down in his heart of hearts, if I can say that, he realizes that if Putin snapped his fingers, he would be out of power in a second. There have been periodic grassroots movements, sort of like Ukraine, that have challenged Lukashenko's authority going back the past 20 years, actually. Each one has been put down. And Eric, Devian, Kara, this would be great master's thesis topics to talk about comparing both of these countries. In fact, I'm advising a project at GW, which is talking about the differences. So the differences are important. The similarities are important. The geostrategic importance of both countries are similar, but the events are going not always in the same track. Most importantly, Russia has handled these situations differently. Now, whether it's learned from its bad experience in Ukraine, where it has essentially been stalemated, at least till this evening, or is it something else going on? The actual Russian calculus in Belarus is very, very difficult to pin down. This came to a head last summer, as one of you mentioned, when the elections clearly not re-electing Lukashenko, even though the books were cooked, elected Ms. Tikhanovskaya, who was running in lieu of her husband to the Belarusian presidency. Lukashenko wouldn't leave. That, as you know, generated constant, weekly, almost daily protests against Lukashenko's rule. Tikhanovskaya and the other dissident leaders have become international celebrities for their work, important, heroic as it has been, but Russia has handled the situation differently. One of the key differences is the Belarusian economy is not like Ukraine in that it is much more Soviet. It is heavily subsidized by the government. The potash is one of the only industries that's lucrative at all. And if Russia took over the Belarusian economy, you would essentially be taking over a bankrupt state, because Russia, even if they gave the potash industry to Putin's friends, which could happen, Russia would have to end the subsidies. Russia essentially would have to subsidize a failed economic state. I don't think Russia wants to do that. And so you see a much more cat and mouse game being played between Moscow and Minsk than you saw that happened in Ukraine. The second major difference, and I don't want to be too provocative here, is that it's not clear to me that the Belarusian opposition is as single-mindedly in favor of a Western course for Belarus. Ukraine is very strongly interested in pursuing a Western course. EU, as I said, NATO. Belarus is much more ambivalent. Now, whether it's because they're clever and don't want a Russian invasion, or whether they have historically more fond ties with Mother Russia, that's part of it too. But what you see then, if you look carefully, is that the forces against Lukashenko are careful always to say this is not an anti-Russian movement. It is a movement against Lukashenko. key difference, a key difference. I would go so far as to say also that some of the elements who support Ms. Tikhanovskaya are not democratic as we understand them. So you may end up, even if Lukashenko left, you may end up with a leadership in Minsk which is not going to be what we think it is or hope it is, pro-Western, democratic as we understand it. So we just have to see. For the moment, however, I think it's fair to say that the opposition has the moral support, not only of many people in the West, most people in the West, but also many Western governments. They have been relatively good at promoting their cause. I'm trying to be analytical here, not saying what I support or what I do, because I think it's important both in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus to try to get a handle on what's going on. But what is going on? What you've seen in Belarus is, again, very different than what is going on in Ukraine. Since the fall, really, you see the closing of the relationship between Lukashenko and Moscow. And it's a relationship that had never been particularly close. Again, I don't think Putin, by all I hear, excuse me, I don't think Putin likes Lukashenko, and I think he wants to get rid of him, but he can't right now. So what you see is the vice around the situation and around the Belarusian opposition slowly closing. Russia appears to be resigned to keeping Lukashenko around for another couple of years, but also closing the space for politics, for economics, for Western-style diplomacy for Belarus. This has not happened in Ukraine, partly because the Ukrainians won't let it happen. Now, I have the Belarus Watch briefing. If anybody is interested, it's a very good update twice a week on developments in Belarus. It came out today, and it lists all the closing relationships between Russia and Moscow, and these are very troubling. There are official celebrations of contacts on Russo-Belarusian Unity Day. There are many signs of more economic integration between Moscow and Minsk. There's a campaign, and there has been since last fall, against the ethnic minorities, especially the Polish ethnic minorities in Belarus. The western part of Belarus, along the Polish border, has a lot of emigres from Poland and Lithuania. They are not only Catholic, which is suspicious to Lukashenko, but the Belarusian authorities think that they may be undermining the state by having unacceptable ties to the West. But if you go through the economy and finance and energy and public administration, it's all being gradually infiltrated by Russian influence, personified in Russian personnel who are there working in Minsk to implement the Russian line, support Lukashenko, and keep the opposition demonstrations at bay. The demonstrations, by the way, in numbers have gone down since last fall. That could be the weather. I've been to Minsk, a lot of gray weather there, but it's hard to say. In particular, Russia, since last summer, has infiltrated the media and internet space with Russian propagandists who will not allow the Belarusian opposition to get its possibly democratic message out. And this is key because controlling information for Moscow is a key element of power. And most troublingly, there are all sorts of signs that Russia's military, or put it the other way, Belarus's military integration with Russia will continue. If you know this, look at the map, you'll see that Belarus is just beyond the edge of the Western military district of the Russian Federation. Kaliningrad is several hundred miles closer to Russia, if the Russian military, if there was a more integrated Russian, Belarusian military activity. The signs alarmingly see this trend going on. That would pose a direct and stronger challenge to NATO just across the border in Lithuania, Poland in particular. So the question is, where's this going to end? There are all sorts of rumors today and yesterday that they will go, they, meaning the Kremlin and Lukashenko, will go for some kind of formal diplomatic union of some sort, perhaps to be announced on May 9th, that would effectively link Belarus with the Russian Federation in a sort of a federated state. The key levers of power, of course, will be held by Putin and his cronies, and that would be a very alarming development and mark a significant revanche on the events of 1990 and 91 when the Soviet Union fell apart. It would also mark an escalation of the security threat to Ukraine, because with Russian troops directly to the north, they are not there now. Ukraine is much threatened by yet another front, one that's relatively close to Kyiv. The Russians and the Belarusian armed forces exercise monthly, once a month at least, combat activity, and that started last September, and that continues. So I don't bet in this business, but I would not be surprised if something toward a more formal integration happened in less than a month. I'm not predicting, but it could happen less than a month at the May 9th Victory Day celebration. Now, let me close my remarks. I think I'm more or less on time with the Biden administration. The Biden administration, only 3 months into office, has a relatively clear outline of what I think it seems to want to do. On Ukraine, as Biden told Putin last week in his phone call, the United States supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine, number one. What that means and how you do it is a long story and worth discussing on the Q&A. Number two, Biden did not talk about Belarus to Putin at all. Belarus tends to be seen in Washington as still relatively under the shadow of the Kremlin, even as we support the opposition movement. The trade-off going back to President Obama has been, how do you push back with Putin without provoking Putin to do something nasty? And that's one of the reasons why the current buildup in Ukraine is so troubling, because neither Ukraine nor the US has been particularly provocative in the past several months. But the big question is how you deal with Russia. And I think if you go back to the readout last Thursday, I think, of the conversation when Biden called Putin, they being our administration, wants to cooperate on areas where they can. That's primarily arms control. Its new variant called strategic stability negotiations, and both the United States and Russia have expressed interest in talking about that. Other areas such as terrorism or climate change could come into the mix. As you might know, Lavrov and Kerry met about 3 weeks ago, and I think Kerry invited Lavrov to his climate change conference later this year. So talking where you can cooperate is a key element of the Biden foreign policy. On the other hand, disagreeing and pushing back where you cannot come to a meeting of the minds is also a central core of Biden's foreign policy. You saw last week in the same call, and the White House readout is on the line, Biden really came down strongly and impressively in favor of Ukraine. And I think a key element of the Biden approach in foreign policy will be to manage those two strands. Talk where you need to, resist where you have to, must, but getting that balance right is very difficult because you cannot keep those things separate forever. If, for example, the disagreement over Ukraine became so bitter, one side or the other, especially probably the Russians, would call off any arms control strategic stability negotiations, almost certainly. Both ambassadors are now back in their home capitals. Lavrov told our ambassador Sullivan the other day, why don't you recall yourself? But reading all the Russian public comments on all of this, I do think they do want to cooperate on the issues I mentioned. We'll just have to see if any progress on the significant differences between those remained. And I would close, and I didn't mention China for a reason, I'll leave that to the Q&A if you're interested, is that the strains on Putin domestically are relatively strong. The economy is not doing very well. COVID was hit hard. Putin's popularity by Putin standards is not particularly high. There are all sorts of social problems in Russia. Some people call Russia a state in decline. And the question on the table, Devian, another great master's topic, does a state in decline behave differently? In Syria, in Libya, in Venezuela, and that's really a question to be answered. Does the state in decline want more, is more likely to be peace in Ukraine and less likely to interfere in the US elections? I think that's a too simplistic interpretation, but it is something that people look at. But managing these issues, not only Russia's rise, but the Chinese problem is very much a challenge for the Biden administration. And we'll see how it goes. Next time I talk to all of you, I'm sure the story will be much further along down the road. So thank you. I've talked for a bit. Now, Bob, questions or however you want to handle the next part of the evening.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jensen. We really appreciate your sharing your insights with us. And we're starting to see questions show up in the chat right now. Let's see here. Let's go with a question from Eric Kunkel, our board chair. How would you compare and describe the nationalism in Russia with that in China?
Ooh, good, excellent question. First of all, Russia is, as you might know, as you probably know, closer and closer to China, not as a partner, not as an ally, but more as a partner. My impression would be that I know more about Russian nationalism, that China has it much more under control in the sense that while both countries proudly are great powers, and again, I can't speak to China with as much confidence, Putin, to his nationalist right, I guess I would say, has a lot more crazies out there than I think China does. Putin is not the only guy in charge. Putin is not the only guy who has a voice, but Putin makes the decisions. And when you see, as earlier this week, our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, call Patrushev, who's the Russian counterpart, you know that Putin is, that Sullivan is going to talk to a very hard-line guy. I think Patrushev would prefer to roll the Russian tanks all the way to Kiev. So there is an element in the Russian political spectrum to the, I hate to use right, I can't think of a better word, that Putin has to manage. Putin tends to take the center-right position on most issues. He probably is more benign or more inclined to talk to the US than some of the others. So that nationalist issue is a problem with Russia, and by no means does Putin have it under control. And in fact, you frequently see Putin complaining about Russian nationalism. So he's very much in the middle of the leadership spectrum.
Thanks very much. And now a question from Dr. Libertis. What should the international community do, re Ukraine or Belarus, or for the surrounding countries that Russia is appearing to threaten?
Well, I think Professor Libertis, right? I think that we should push back hard. I think in some ways we have been not forceful enough. And I think we ought to make it very clear that we support Ukraine. We ought to arm Ukraine within reasonable limits. And I think it's important that Putin knows that we are not going to blink if we appear to be weak. Remember, the Kremlin exploits vulnerabilities, and they're very good at detecting those. It's very important that we keep a united front with our allies, and that's a real challenge because the German relationship is important, as it should be, to the Biden people, and keeping Germany on board, pushing back against Putin is really a big challenge. From the beginning, you remember 5 years ago, people were talking about rolling over sanctions and all that kind of thing. And that required, think of it, almost 30 NATO members to agree, and EU members to agree on sanctioning Russia. And several countries were not all happy about that. Italy, Spain, France. So that kind of alliance politics of necessity makes it extremely difficult to prevent Putin with a unified approach. So, and second, I think it's important, as I said, to keep one message out there. Your infringement on Russia's sovereignty, on Ukraine's sovereignty, is not acceptable, and we intend to oppose that. So I think in that sense, the Biden people are off to a pretty good start. I would say, however, that the issue of promoting U.S. values in the way that we did during the end of the Cold War isn't very important. Cultural exchanges, all the kinds of people-to-people activity, which really made a difference in ending the Soviet Union, I think are really important. And if you look at Russian public opinion polls, the young people in particular are more positive toward the United States than you might think. Russia's a very diverse country, to say the obvious, and the public opinion is very nuanced in some things. And the public opinion shows, for example, that a military operation in Ukraine will not be all that popular with many Russians compared to 6 years ago. So we need to be aware of the diversity, see our opportunities for advancing our agenda, and not quite be so defensive.
Well, thank you very much for that plug. One of my questions was going to be about what value citizen exchanges or soft power might have in this, and we've hosted numerous delegations from that part of the world.
Well, I was about to compliment TGA for doing that. It's extremely important, and the Russians and Belarusians and Ukrainians remember that for a long time. And the symbolism of openness, that we have a system to be admired and emulated, is really important. Putin sees that as a threat. How do we know that? Because Putin has shut out almost all US NGOs out of the country. And, I lived in Moscow for a long time. I was there toward the end of the Cold War. I was only 6 years old, but I was a child diplomat. And people bring this stuff up to you all the time. People brought up Lend-Lease 50 years later. So it's very, very important. I had not to be too materialistic, but I had a friend at RFE who was Bulgarian, and he used to go to the embassy movies every Friday night. And he said, God, that was so much fun. But Don, I would watch these movies, and people in Hollywood would open the refrigerator in the movies, and you know what? It was full of food. I never saw that before. And second, it was not commented on, so I knew it was a normal thing. So little symbols, little things that exposure are very important. Again, Bob, to all of you, that's what makes your work so important, your outreach. This kind of frozen system of bad relationships and poisonous rhetoric, it's not going to last forever. And the things that you do now that are not just offensive and negative will go a long way. Will go a long way. I should also say that the chance to see the United States, Oklahoma, the Midwest, the Rockies, it's all very, very important. It means a lot to people. People don't forget that kind of thing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jensen. There are several questions here that could be linked or read in a sequence. So let me try this. First one is, do you think that the Biden administration and NATO should move troops closer to Ukraine? Second question along those lines, what are the possibilities of admitting Ukraine to NATO? And if that were to happen, what chain of events do you think that would set in motion, and how would it affect or change Russian-American relations?
Well, it would be Russia, by the way, as you know, the elite Putin does not regard Ukraine as a separate country, more or less how we would regard Texas, maybe, or California. NATO has reinforced its eastern flank very significantly in recent years, mostly in the Baltic, all the way down to Poland in particular. Before the Ukraine crisis, it was not very reinforced at all. So the Russian argument that NATO expansion is a threat is really very bogus, because Russia cooperated with NATO till 2009, and there were very few troops, even after expansion, to threaten Russia. It would be regarded now, Bob, as, I think, threatening, even as NATO, both as an alliance and individual members, have moved to bolster Ukraine's defenses. The actual stationing would be seen as threatening, and I don't think that that's going to happen. The second part of the second question, is Ukraine going to be in NATO? I would say no, for a lot of reasons. Many alliance members don't want them in. It's too threatening to Russia. Ukraine has to meet certain benchmarks in terms of civil control over the military, for example, that it's not met yet. But I think whether it's a direct bilateral relationship with us, or a partnership for peace type program that doesn't promise NATO membership anytime soon, I think I would favor that. I think it's a good idea, because part of Ukraine's military problem is not the troops, which are now much improved. It's the infrastructure, it's buying weapons, it's the military industrial complex, it's procurement, issues like that, which still run more or less along a Soviet model. The Chinese, by the way, are buying up a lot of assets in the military industrial complex. So will Ukraine be in NATO? Maybe not, likely not, but in a way you don't really need that. The revolution has already occurred in the minds and hearts of the people. They're very much more Western thinking than they get credit for. So I think they are very likely to be content for the next decade or two with a closer security relationship with the West. Zelensky's comments the other day about NATO membership, I understand that. I support it as an aspiration, but I don't think there's a realistic proposition anytime soon.
Thank you. And then another question, which could be the final sequence of those three. If Russia does end up invading Ukraine, what would be the next step for the Biden administration to take?
There are a number of steps. For all the talk of sanctions, and sanctions are often criticized, there are a number of really tough sanctions likely to, that they still have in their arsenal. Sanctioning Putin per se, cutting Russia off from the SWIFT account. If there's actual fighting, I think the US would most definitely step up its weapons supplies for Ukraine. So we just have to see. We go back to the same asymmetry, which is to say Russia has a much more larger army, much more effective. What Ukraine lacks is the things you need to hold off an invasion: air force, naval support. And that has argued, a lot of people have argued this week that that suggests there will be a Russian move on the Black Sea toward Crimea and so forth. But Russia very clearly is also militarizing the whole arc from the Russian-Georgian border all the way across the Black Sea. They're making it essentially a militarized Russian lake. And independent of Ukraine's situation, a lot of people are very upset about that. They're watching carefully, and you saw that the Brits are going to put a couple of warships through the Bosporus and Dardanelles into the Black Sea in May. These kinds of shows of force are important.
Thank you. And then Kara Tilley has a question. Has Russia post-COVID leaned towards economic strength or militarization? And could you comment on Russia's vaccine diplomacy?
Sure, Kara. You blend two things together, the vaccine diplomacy and the economic strength. Is that the other part of your question? Russia's economy is doing very badly. Not so bad as to dissuade it from its ambitions, but badly in the sense that growth is pretty stagnant. Corruption, which is a much higher popular concern to people than democracy, is still a very, very high. Putin's cronies are very, very influential still. So no one, all the reports I've seen, expects a vigorous Russian economy in the next decade. And in fact, I think the growth is slightly below one or around zero this year. China and the US apparently are going to be much more prosperous. So I think with the choices, guns or butter, Putin will pick guns, Kara, but we have to see. All these adventures, Syria, Venezuela, they apparently can afford on their own without cutting back on some of their activity, unfortunately. And so we're going to have, so I think we're going to see more of that. So again, Russia's economically in sort of long-term secular decline in the economy, but whether that will change how it operates is kind of not clear. On COVID, they developed their own vaccine. By some press reports, it's relatively effective. I'm not Anthony Fauci, I can't say for sure, but they certainly had a large number of cases and a large number of deaths from the disease. And I think they certainly suffered in their own way. COVID has also been high in the area of occupied Ukraine and the Donbass. COVID has actually been high in the Russian armed forces. Last spring, they even offered to NATO to postpone some exercises, if NATO would, because the situation with the military was not healthy regarding the virus. So they seem to be recovering from it now, but you have a medical care that is in large part not at Western standards. You have a very bureaucratic system, so it's been a real problem. Actually, one more point, Bob. Kara, even as it got credit in places like Italy for its vaccine, because Putin's opportunistic like the Chinese. He sees a chance. You send some COVID vaccine to Italy, it's in the Italian papers, people are impressed, that kind of thing. A lot of it's public diplomacy.
Thank you. We're approaching the end of our time. Does anyone have a final question for Dr. Jensen? Either about Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, or about baseball?
What is your hope that'll happen this year in 2021? What is your hope that'll happen in that region with Russia, with Belarus, with Ukraine?
Well, Belarus Belarus, I would hope that again, you said what I would like, not what I think. I would like pigs to fly too. I think the Belarus situation is going to deteriorate badly. And what I would hope is that Lukashenko would leave or come to sort of a deal with the opposition for perhaps a gradual withdrawal of Lukashenko from politics. That was talked about a lot last fall. You may remember there was talk of a new constitution. There's very little talk about that now, partly because Russia won't let it. And so I'm not very optimistic. In Ukraine, I want Russia to stand down with this military nonsense. I want Zelensky to bite the bullet in terms of pushing back on the domestic corruption, which undermines the democratic system. Ukraine is a democracy, but until you clean up some of the corruption around the leftover from the old regime, that's going to be very, very hard to keep his popularity, which has dropped a lot. He's got 2 more years, I think, on his term. So what I hope, Ruby, can I say Ruby, would be that, and Ukraine continues to make, I would say, steady progress toward integrating with the West. And that can be zigzag, that can be 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. But over the longer term, even if Putin moved tomorrow morning. I think that in Ukraine, at least, is inevitable. And that's a kind of provocative thing to say, but I'll say it. With Belarus, it's much less certain.
Thank you. I think there's baseball comments and
Yeah,
questions.
baseball questions are starting to show up now. Bruce,
Anything you
maybe-
want, guys. Anything you
Yeah.
want.
Bruce has a question on Black Sox 8.
Yes, I was just reading about Jill Chetty, who was the first confessee to the Black Sox 8. Can you elaborate?
Well, elaborate on this scandal, or
Well, on his role in it, and the fact that apparently he was promised a $10,000 bonus, but then from the bench.
I think that's true, Bruce. They welched on it, and he got in trouble because of that. My good friend Bill Lamb, Bruce, at Sabre, he lives in New Hampshire, is the world's expert on this subject. And if you Google him, he's written some really important stuff on the topic. I love the movie 8 Men Out, Bruce, but a lot of it is just fantasy. It's made up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jensen. And I enjoyed your talk very much, and it really enlightened me on the whole Central European issue.
Thanks.
And this may be our last question. What about baseball do you most enjoy?
Wow, what a great question. I do love the father to son, or to grandmother to father to son tradition about it. For me, it's America. And for me, do you know the Ken Burns baseball series? I've seen it 20 times, and I pick out all the mistakes, but I'm absolutely riveted by it every time. Eric, I can't even do anything else when I watch it. So that's what I like, the tradition. I write a lot about not games or teams or people. I write about the game off the field, the saloons, the show business people, all that kind of thing. And I'm searching for a publisher for a number of pieces. And if any of you use YouTube,
Yes.
if you go to Sabre 19th Century Speakers Series, you'll see my comments on Harry Stevens, who was the presenter of Hot Dogs at Ballparks, and the life and times of New York in the Gilded Age. It's got a lot of reaction. So it's online. It's online. The key to all this, Bob, is that you have to realize that sleep is overrated if you're having a good time.
Agree.
Agree. Let me put that link into the chat here for the Sabre series. And Dr. Jensen, thank you very much for your time with us. We really appreciate
My pleasure. My
for
pleasure.
sharing your insights and taking our questions.
Thank you. Are we going to be video too, or just audio?
Yeah, we're going to post this video to Tulsa Global Alliance's YouTube channel. So yeah, we'll get
okay.
The video and the audio of this talk.
Okay.
And we appreciate everyone who joined us today. And if you enjoyed this event, please follow Tulsa Global Alliance, sign up for our newsletter through our website, and subscribe to our YouTube channels to see future videos about programs just like this.
And keep up your good work on the outreach and all those things you do. As I said, it's very important. And it may seem underappreciated, but you know, it's not underappreciated. It makes a big difference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be showing this to my students.